Good morning. I'd like to welcome our speakers and audience to the Symposium Roundtable on this beautiful Saturday morning in Rome. I feel so privileged to be here. Today, we're going to focus on a topic more about understanding matronage in a new light. As we've seen in the last 2 days of the symposium, women were engaged in the creation of the built environment in a variety of roles before 1800. As paid laborers and material suppliers on the construction site, as commissioned designers, as amateur designers and managers who designed and built works on their own estates. Women offered critical assessments of the built environment through their written word, and they acted as agents who, through their social networks, supported and connected designers and patrons engaged in many activities that advanced the fruition of architectural works. Yet until recently, little has been known about women's engagement in the built environment before the modern era, other than perhaps Consuelo's wonderful book, I think it's 2017, on Patti Labrici. But other than this, it's really, the literature has very much been focused on patronage. And this is since the mid-1990s. Scholarship on women's patronage of architecture has occupied center stage as the main body of literature investigating women. This academic stage is shared by a very interesting field of research, that of gender in architecture, which does have some studies, before 1800. Although both studies of scholarship they're in a sense a foundation that should inform all future study of the variety of roles that we've seen today. Today's roundtable will exclusively function on women patrons of architecture and their impact in both the public and private spheres. On the screen, you can see, we can't see my PowerPoint. We need to see my PowerPoint. What you're going to see is just a couple of images of women that I drew from the women that will be talked about today in the presentations. Now, recognizing this body of literature on women's patronage, I'm not going to do a historiography, we're just going to recognize it here. And knowing the broader context for women presented in this symposium, we're now in a position to question and challenge assumptions about women's role in the built environment. We have in our hands a rare gem. We have the opportunity now to establish a new perspective on women's place and value in the creation of the built environment before 1800. I've often thought by, in a sense, kind of turning the prism on pre-modern women's patronage, can we begin to see matronage itself in a new light? Today, we're going to address two problems that I see in the scholarship on women's patronage, and I will encourage a few new directions regarding that. And if I can go forward here. The first issue I like to call the umbrella issue. I think that this broader perspective calls for a redefinition of women's roles that until now have all been kind of grouped under the umbrella, of patronage studies. Historians have used the term patronage as an umbrella for women's many diverse forms of intellectual and financial support for the design and management of works, and for their influence on architectural design through critique, social networking, and social reform. I think we tend to place these activities within the realm of patronage because there are ways in which women supported the advancement of the environment. I'd like to suggest that by placing these roles under this umbrella will perpetuate two unfavorable situations. Firstly, women have historically been those who help, those who support any given activity. And this support is usually unpaid because women who are not poor are traditionally taken care of and cannot accept money for any time and effort that they've put into something. Women have historically had a stigmatized relationship to money. Many of the roles women play in the built environment could continue to be seen simply as unpaid support, as something less active and less valuable than what the men were doing. Instead, I suggest that we begin to see women's unpaid supportive activities as one of the realms of activity for women in the built environment. I propose more clearly naming their actions, bringing them into the light, and honoring all of those realms of support which made the built environment happen. Unpaid support is a part of women's history. Secondly, we need to clarify, in some cases, rename the activities in which women were engaged. Without doing so, these women's roles and their influence will remain in the shadows of history. Language implies cultural meaning and holds a certain power over how we think and reason. Naming women's actions with distinct and emboldened terminology gives recognition to their value within their given social and economic context. We may discover that not all women's engagement with designing and building should necessarily be categorized as patronage, but rather some actions constitute distinct other worlds of accomplishment. As an example, in the first symposium, A Passion for Design, many of the women in these cases were referred to as patrons, yet were designing and building their own homes, either with or without the assistance of an architect, and of course, sometimes doing their own drawings. Some were considered to be the authors of their own work by their contemporaries. In today's terminology, they would be called either an amateur or a self-builder, which is a very more modern term that we can discuss later. But they would never be called a patron today. If you have a vacant lot, you decide to build a house on it, and you decide to design and build it yourself, they're not going to call you a patron to who? Unto yourself? So this is kind of the line of thinking. A renaming and recategorization of their actions can open new perspectives on these women builders. A subtle taxonomy developed to describe and design the building process would also be relevant to the understanding and naming of men's patronage as well in the early modern period. Let's go forward here. Oh, we did the umbrella issue. Another issue that I asked that we begin to describe, or another reason why I asked that we begin to describe matronage in these new terms, has to do with what I perceive as the reception of women's patronage within the discipline of architectural history. Now, mind you, mine is an American perspective. I can't speak for the European perspective or the Turkish perspective or the Indian perspective, so I'm hoping in our discussion we might open that up. But if we look at the programs of architectural history conferences and journals, and if we look at how architectural history is taught at American institutions, women's patronage partakes very little in the conversation, if at all. Like gender studies, historical women's patronage and studies of modern women in architecture have separate conferences and places for publication apart from architectural history. Now, this may be due in part to the large size of scholarship needing additional outlets. Yet I see that the studies on women in some ways are not in alignment with the interests of architectural history. Women's studies tend to focus on biography and social issues rather than the architecture itself. The study of women in the built environment in general is fraught with particular difficulties. Women's engagement often remains in the shadow due to the paucity of archival evidence, due to culturally ordained silences on women's relationship to money and to the public sphere, and due to traditional stereotypes and distortions of truth about women, which are part of the historical record. These challenges are difficult to sort out when trying to write a history. Developing new perspectives on matronage for me means deconstructing the umbrella issue and realigning this part of women's history with architectural history. Now that we can demonstrate the variety of roles in addition to patronage in the built environment before 1800, I would like to see women's history become more central to the discipline. I think one way that we can do this is by expanding or shifting our research just slightly, and these analyses to the women's actual architectural works, and by using innovative methods to demonstrate the work's value to the specific social and economic context. A wonderful study that already does this is by Dee Fairchild Ruggles in her recent 2020 book, Tree of Pearls, The Extraordinary Architectural Patronage of the 13th Century Egyptian Slave Queen, Shahad al-Dur. Ruggles deftly tied the patron's complex biography to her self-constructed and ornamented mausoleum, and she demonstrated the architecture's important place as a design concept that changed the characteristic domed skyline of Cairo as we see today. Another good model is from 2007. This is Lucien Tis Senokak's book, Ottoman Women Builders. This particular book draws from women's history. She also uses gender studies and certain feminist theory, and also presents architectural analysis in her book. It's a wonderful study. The last thing, but not least, there's so many things that I could mention, but I think I need to bring to your attention is the work of Spanish scholars. They are doing a lot on women. Particularly innovative is, I think, that of Candida Martinez Lopez, who studies ancient Roman matrons. She has very innovative conceptual and methodological work. She's recently presented it in 2021 in a chapter in a book in English. Her literature is in Spanish, but this is in English, which would be available to a different kind of audience now, I think. But she looks at some very interesting methods of mapping ancient Roman women and framing the importance of matronage to Roman society. Now, by choosing to look at matronage in a new light in this roundtable, I believe we are selecting a tool to help sweep away some of the shadow given to us in archival research. We are willing to entertain multiple and opposing perspectives, and we are searching for alternative ways of reading primary sources. In this roundtable today, we're going to see basically two areas of emerging research. The first three speakers are going to discuss historical women who were influential in shaping the design of cities and who acted as, instead of arbiters of taste, I would say arbiters of the public space or the image of the public space. After that, the four following speakers will address the more private sphere of domestic and religious architecture and entertain questions about authorship in the design process of architecture. I will introduce each speaker just very briefly so we can move through them very quickly. They are short presentations compared to the rest of the symposium, and then we'll have a discussion on some of these issues. So first, I would like to introduce and welcome Margaret Woodhall, who will give us her perspective on ancient Roman matronage. Oriented here for a second. Okay, before we start the clock, let me add my voice to the chorus of gratitude that has already been expressed by everybody for this wonderful convening of people. Thank you, Shelley. And thank you, Consuela and Francesca, and bow at the altar of Fabio together, everybody. But also to everyone whose wonderful papers have been so inspiring and hopeful, actually, really hopeful. So thank you. And I just also want to say, as an aside, thank you to all of you non-native English speakers who have probably spent decades working to learn English and for presenting to us in English. It's a privilege that I think we often overlook. So thank you. All right, now you can start the clock. All right. Roman women and buildings in Roman women and buildings in the Roman Empire. I'm not even using that title anymore. Too big of a topic to cover in 10 minutes. So before I dive into the substance of my talk, it's important to know that I've shifted gears from talking about all women's building patronage across the vast empire for nearly 4 centuries. You'll thank me for that. And instead took to heart 2 points, 2 of Shelley's points in her charge to us. Examine women's roles in shaping the built environment and the cultural and political implications of these, and to consider the ways we might reinterpret their patronizing activities. So what has emerged from this process is a short, very short, sketch of imperial matronage in Rome and some thoughts on the ideological pressures that impacted their production as the first female architectural benefactors in the city's history. Okay, so first a brief overview of the matronage landscape. In ancient Rome, the phenomenon of women as architectural benefactors only begins as Rome's republic gave way to empire and state governance shifted from a representative senate to an autocratic dynastic monarchy. It was during the initial years of this transformation that the imperial women of the emerging Julio-Claudian dynasty ascended the stage of public life and, for the first time in the city's nearly 800-year history, joined their male counterparts in the ambitious urban regeneration that accompanied Augustus's rise to power and the inception of a new imperial order. From the emperor's sister Octavia, whose portico, oh, no, not yet, whose portico you see there in the slide, through one of the dynasty's last empresses, Agrippina, imperial women embellished the capital city with temples, porticos, sticky pages, just a moment, temples, porticos, markets, and green spaces, with Rome's first empress, Livia, alone contributing more monuments than many of the emperors who would succeed her husband across time. The source of this unprecedented phenomenon, I have argued elsewhere, was not simply the rise of a dynastic monarchy in Rome, but was demonstrably imbricated and tied to a growing ideological discourse that centered the generative female body as a foundational element in the production of this new order. Both visual and literary metaphors of generativity abounded during this period, and none more powerfully articulated it than the materiality of grand structures erected by the very dynastic bodies that were engendering the new political order. Oh, okay. Better.
Okay. With their characteristically Roman dedicatory inscriptions, an example of which you see here from the Empress Livia's reconstruction of a temple for Fortuna Muliebris, or womanly fortune, imperial women's buildings embodied the newfound authority that quite literally came from their bodies, their biology. Beyond Rome, across a growing empire, elite non-imperial women followed suit. Modeling themselves after their imperial matrons, they elaborated their local cities and towns with lavish city gates, colonnades, baths, sanctuaries, entertainment complexes, and commercial structures, as in the two iconic examples that you see here in the Eumachia building in Pompeii and Placia Magna's city gate in Turkey. Indeed, contemporary scholars like Emily Hemelrich in the Netherlands and Candida Martinez Lopez in Granada are demonstrating that Rome's colonial and provincial urban centers were extraordinarily rich in women's monumental munificence. But in the interest of time, I'm going to leave this thread aside for our discussion and return us to Rome to try to complicate and texturize the narrative of female matronage just a bit more. Now, while the material and written record demonstrates that outside Rome, non-imperial matrons continuously monumentalized their local communities from the start of the imperial era well into late antiquity, in Rome, the fall of the Julio-Claudian dynasty brings a rupture to imperial matronage. For nearly a century and a half, imperial women ceased to build. During this time, instead of being active patrons of the built environment, imperial women became passive recipients of monumental commemoration, not in life, but in death. Bummer. I've explored this demise elsewhere in greater detail, but here I will simply say that the reasons for this rupture are not entirely clear, but I'll try to explain a little bit. Now, exploring the historical circumstances of the last monument built by an empress before this lacuna is instructive. Erected by the Dowager Empress Agrippina in 54 CE to honor her late husband and secure her son Nero's succession to the throne, the Temple of Divine Claudius not only crowned the Caelian Hill, it impressively constituted the largest single sanctuary in Rome in its day. And you can see that. The amphitheater wasn't there at the time, but, well, complicated, but you can see that it's pretty large. It's pretty grand scale. Yet, despite the empress's ambitions for the grand structure, it and its benefactresses' fortunes were not to endure. Indeed, merely 5 years after the sanctuary's inception, Nero had his mother dispatched. Our primary account of her death from Tacitus is brutal, and the fate of the sanctuary afterwards is pointedly telling. In the historian's account, at the moment that Agrippina understands her son Nero's treachery, the empress opens her robes to invite the swordsman to begin by eviscerating her womb, the source of the treachery, but also the source of her building authority. Soon thereafter, Nero set about dismantling the very structure by the woman who, by virtue of her womb, ensured his political ascent. Now, while direct causality cannot explain the historical relationships between these events, as discursive artifacts operating within dynastic ideology, with its elevation of the reproductive female to positions of public authority, these elements, that is, the appearance of Rome's grandest sanctuary at the hand of an imperial matron, the account of her murder at the biological site of her generativity, and the subsequent destruction of her building, align to suggest that Agrippina and her oversized sanctuary may just have discovered the tolerable limits of female authority in the monumental space of the emperor's city. I hope that makes sense. So, in closing, If this admittedly all too brief account of lost female agency within Rome's dynastic order is disappointing, take heart and let me offer a salvo. I've not quite worked out the historical connections, but I think it is not incoincidental that in the decades that immediately followed Agrippina's death and the disappearance of imperial women as creators of the imperial city, we find them appearing in a strikingly different architectural context, namely in the production of the very bricks demanded by the increasingly vast construction industry generated by the imperial city and its environs. Indeed, studies of Roman brick production from around the Roman countryside and their characteristic stamps with the identifying marks that include maker names that accompanied these foundational architectural elements of the urban environment. These revealed that women of both imperial and non-imperial rank figured significantly in their production. Some 30% of our domini, that is the owners of the properties where clay pits and brick production occurred, and approximately 6% of all known officinatores, supervisors and workers involved in the actual making and firing of the bricks, and this latter group comprises mainly middle class, lower class, and slave classes, and that's a story for the chapter. These were women. Among that 30% of the domini, the women whom we know, 70% comprised women of imperial families, spiking, not coincidentally, I think, with the women of the Flavian dynasty, which followed the Julio-Claudians. And here I'm just showing you some examples of bricks produced in women's production facilities, and that's just an example of what Roman bricks look like. So, through inheritance, often from their mothers, women of the extended imperial entourage continued robustly producing bricks through the dynasties that followed into the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Thus, while their names may have disappeared as benefactresses from the grand inscriptions across public buildings in Rome, it makes me smile not a little to know that they remained present in the very materiality, those very fundamental building blocks of the monumental world that continued to grow around them. Thank you.
Next, we have a remote presentation that will be by Jyoti Pandey Sharma. The title of her presentation is Invisible Patrons and Stewardship of the Faith, the Begami Masjids, mosques built by Mughal ladies of the Mughal Badshahi Shahar, the imperial city, Shahjahanabad. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Thank you so much. Jyoti.
Thank you very much. Like everybody else, I would at the outset like to thank you, Professor Roff, for putting this thing together. And as is evident from the title that you just pronounced, I'm going to look at the Indian subcontinent, particularly the 17th century Mughal imperial city of Shahjahanabad, which is popularly known as Old Delhi today. So my story, to borrow from what Professor Chatterjee said last night, has 3 protagonists, unlike a lot of cases where there have largely been one. And these 3 protagonists are from the 17th century, and they get 3 more in the subsequent century, which is the 18th century. So these protagonists are the Mughal Begums. This is, I'll just do a quick construction of what the Mughal Begums are in this particular slide. So these are the wives and daughters of the Mughal imperial family. They're equipped with enormous amount of intellectual, social, and monetary capital. They live in what is called the harem, which is a gendered space within the Mughal palace fort. They are known only by their titles, which means that we don't know their names. Their titles were generally bestowed by men, and they could range from an abstract notion like Mumtaz Mahal to a more specific and a more tangible notion like Fatehpuri Begum, which meant that Fatehpuri being her title, which implied that she came from a place called Fatehpur. The Mughal women, the Mughal begums rather, were parda nashini, which means that they were veiled. So they were completely invisibilized in public realm. In terms of the records, archival and contemporary, there is a near complete absence from all forms of Mughal archival records of any reference to the Mughal begums, even if they are mentioned in passing, which is largely the case, barring certain exceptions. Their descriptions or their accounts are by men. To further complicate matters, colonial archival accounts have caricaturized women as regressive. There are two exceptions that stand out in this regard. We have Begum Noor Jahan and Begum Jahan Ara. Jahan Ara is particularly relevant for our context in a roundabout sort of a way, who have till very recently been regarded as the mascots of matronage. My paper, my presentation will focus not on Jahan Ara, not on Noor Jahan, but I've picked three 17th century Mughal begums: Fatehpuri Begum, Akbarabadi Begum, and Sirhindi Begum. Begum is their title. And these women inhabited 17th century Shahjahanabad as Shah Jahan's wives. Shah Jahan was the emperor who founded the city. And their patronage, of course, spans a range of buildings, but I am particularly looking at the mosque. So the question that I'm asking is, what motivated the Begum's matronage? So clearly it was power, piety, dynastic tradition, familial duty, self-representation, and memory. So the Mughal begums were subscribing to the tenets of Mughal adab meaning etiquette. This was an institutionalized set of protocols that both men and women had to subscribe to. So in the case of women, there was a separate set of codal requirements that had to be followed. Traditionally and typically, all Mughal begums functioned as backroom advisors to the ruler, which could have been their son or could have been their consort. They were also regarded as the custodians of the Mughals' Timurid legacy. They were expected to showcase their piety in public. Now, this is where the mosque begins to play an important role. The piety could be demonstrated or showcased in a number of ways: by going to religious places, by offering alms to the poor, by indulging in other forms of charity. But in terms of the tangible representation of piety, building of religious infrastructure was significant. And in my case, I'm going to look at mosques. By building mosques, I'm arguing that the Begums were also conforming to the imperial diktat to raise mosques across the empire. Now, this imperial diktat had been issued by the emperor, who, as opposed to his grandfather, who was very, very egalitarian, has largely been described in the text as being a staunch and rather orthodox follower of Islam. So much so that when he founded the capital city in the 17th century, the new capital, which moved from another capital, and this was a new city that was founded, the city was envisaged not only to be an epicenter of Mughal power, it was also envisaged to be the epicenter of Islam. The women also, I argue, are representing themselves through patronage in a scenario which is dominated by male building patronage. And this is attested to by the texts on history of architecture right from the colonial era. In fact, even going back to the Mughal era, in accounts by court chroniclers, then followed by the colonial texts, and followed by post-independent Indian books on history of architecture that talk about building patronage of men, especially when it comes to the Mughal dynasty, with all women lying by the side. The women, I also argue, are perpetuating the Mughals' self-appointed role as upholders of Islam. And then in the sense of trying to understand what else could have possibly motivated the Begum's matronage, because power, piety, dynastic tradition, familial duty, self-representation, memory, these are drivers of matronage that these women shared with other women patrons, as we have seen in the last two days of the session. And in fact, in the context of building of mosques, I would argue that these are drivers that would have been found in other cultural geographies of Islam as well. So what is it about these begums that kind of that is prompting them to do what they are doing? And they're doing this collectively in the sense that the three mosques that they will build are all built at the same time. So certainly, even if there is an absence of archival records, there is a assumption that I am making here, which seems to be fairly plausible, that the women probably got together and they had an agenda. So I'm trying to understand what this agenda could have been. Now, one very apparent thing that comes to mind is visibilization, because they are completely conspicuous by their absence from the public realm and from the mosque, a building that they are themselves patronizing. And the other thing that I'm saying is rather provocative, I would say, that there is almost a collective sisterhood of matronage, where the three women, along with their stepdaughter, who is Begum Jahan Ara, are coming together, or a collective one-upmanship against their stepdaughter. So in my assessment, which is based on the reading of familial dynamics of the Mughal family, I suspect, at least for now, that the latter may probably be true. Now, why I say this is that Shah Jahan commemorated his favorite wife, Begum Mumtaz Mahal, and Mumtaz Mahal has been immortalized by the construction of the Taj Mahal. So clearly his affections lay very, very strongly with Mumtaz Mahal, and Jahan Ara Begum is his eldest daughter. Following the demise of Mumtaz Mahal, which prompted the building of the Taj Mahal, Shah Jahan, in complete disregard of Mughal adab, granted the title of Badshah Begum, which translates as the first lady of the empire, to his daughter instead of to his wife. That's absolutely unheard of. It's very, very unusual. So as a result of this political move, and a familial move, Jahan Ara becomes, as far as the women of the Mughal family are concerned, she becomes the epicenter of power. So then there is Jahan Ara herself, who has very, very strong Sufi inclinations, and is able to demonstrate, because of her wealth and because of the clout that she holds in the Mughal family, she demonstrates an almost unprecedented religious patronage of her Sufi pir, which is a Sufi master, which is again completely unheard of prior to the 17th century. Also, she doesn't stop there. She is also breaching the bastion of masculine patronage by building the Jami Masjid at Agra. Now, the Jami Masjid is, if we look at the hierarchy of mosques in Islamic cultural geographies, the Jami Masjid is at the top of the pyramid. And traditionally and conventionally, this largely the patronage of the Jami Masjid was vested in the hands of men of power. Now, here in the case of the Mughals, we have a woman, and who happens to be the emperor's daughter, who is patronizing the Jami Masjid. And the Jami Masjid was built in the city of Agra, which kind of preceded Shahjahanabad as the Mughal capital. And also in a way, it predates and probably serves as an archetype for the mosques that the Begums will build. So I am kind of suggesting, and I'm questioning, that are the Begums collectively asserting their religious identity as staunch Sunnis in an empire where Muslims were in a minority and religious assertion was important? Also, Sufism was flourishing and was particularly being patronized by their stepdaughter. So what are the Begums trying to do? So by aligning themselves as a sisterhood and building mosques as opposed to infrastructure catering to Sufis, are they trying to assert their religious identity? Because Shah Jahan was not really a patron of the Sufis. In fact, while he did not stop his daughter, in fact, both Shah Jahan and his eldest son and heir apparent, Dara Shikoh, were both staunch Sufis. they patronized Sufi saints. They composed and wrote treatises on the Sufis. And this was something that Shah Jahan did not dissuade, but it is known from the archives that he himself was not a staunch follower. So are the Begums now taking advantage of that kind of a situation where they are saying that the two closest people to the emperor are his eldest son and the eldest daughter, and by building the mosques in keeping with the imperial diktat, are the Begums trying to signal something?
Thank you, Jyoti. This is really fascinating. And we're going to have many questions for you at the end. Thank you.
I haven't quite finished. Can I finish what I'm saying?
We're a little bit over time, so we're going to move to the next speaker. Thank
I'm
you.
just indicating the mosques on this slide here. And
Okay.
maybe I can come back to this, because what I'm trying to say is that the near complete absence of archival records will just allow me to read this based on the prevailing political and sociocultural context, familial dynamics, examining the city itself and the mosque itself. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to introduce Alper Metin, who's going to be speaking on women shaping the Ottoman capital from Saliha to Naksidil Sultan, 1730 to 1817. Alper is from the Universidad de Bologna.
Good morning. Thank you all for putting all this together and having me. I will speak about the Ottoman court ladies known as sultanas, who have been distinguished for their pronounced architectural visibility throughout the country since the very beginning. We are very used to the narrative of also women in the Ottoman context, so I'm going to try to revert this and will show you that also men did great things following women. The influence of women was particularly evident in the capital, Istanbul, and has gained growing momentum from 16th century onwards. These philanthropic ladies, often consorts, sisters, or mothers of ruling emperors, have contributed significantly to the urban landscape in different scales. On one hand, they have endowed the city with numerous social and religious complexes, reflecting major aspirations, as we have seen with Ceren's presentation yesterday. And on the other hand, they were also active in the construction of single buildings, such as fountains or bridges, to fulfill the daily needs of the dwellers. Today, it is well established that the architectural matronage of the sultanas largely followed that of their male counterparts, but I argue that this only applies till the beginning of the 18th century, which was to inaugurate a period of unprecedented female emancipation in Istanbul. Last significant example of this situation is the sizable complex erected by the charismatic Valide Sultan, so the Queen Mother, Emetullah Rabia Gülnuş, in Üsküdar. Inaugurated in 1711 and centered around the monumental mosque, this complex encompasses various smaller scale structures that we frequently find in sultanic commissions, such as the tomb of the patron, a public kitchen, an elementary school, a sebil, etc. With these characteristics, the complex could have been built also by the Sultan himself, Ahmed III, who, despite being an enthusiastic patron of architecture, did not undertake the construction of a predominantly religious complex of this kind. However, this was nothing new. The change seems to have occurred with the Sultanate of Mahmud I from 1730. While a brand new westernizing architectural gusto was crystallizing in the capital, the so-called Ottoman Baroque, also the urban aspects of the local building habits were gradually mutating. Smaller architectural ensembles named manzume, comprising of fewer buildings, became the new propulsive force alongside with and as much as larger complexes. Noteworthy among the manzumes commissioned by court ladies is the one of Saliha Sultan, who, together with her son Mahmud I and the chief eunuch of the harem, so the highest official of the empire, Hacı Beşir, established new architectural and urban norms. Her manzume consisted of only 2 volumes, one housing an elementary school on the upper floor and shops on the ground level. As I have already discussed in a previous publication, the reason behind such enthusiasm of the sultanas for the establishment of elementary schools was the fact that those were the sole educational institutions accessible to girls. The second volume is a water building that incorporates a sebil and 2 fountains. This structure adhered to a new architectural type known as square fountain, closely mirroring the design of the one commissioned by Ahmet III in 28. I will look at the inscription of this building, since in this period Ottoman women did not really leave ego documents, but the inscriptions of their buildings were certainly discussed with the poets before being carved. The one of the water building of Saliha Sultan is rather interesting. One verse notably emphasizes the recurring threat of conflagrations in Istanbul, poignantly stating how many fires burned and destroyed Galata. Following verses draw attention on the endeavors of the Sultana to obviate 2 of the most pressing challenges faced by the city, the continuous fires and the need of drinking water. Indeed, the Galata area had experienced numerous and extremely dramatic fires before the implementation of the new water line, initiated under the patronage of the son Mahmud I, with significant support from his mother and chief eunuch. Presented here is a map featuring all fountains, conduits, and other water-related constructions within the scope of this new infrastructure. Notably, the 2 elaborate square fountains, one commissioned by the Sultana and the other by the son, are marked at the left corner. Furthermore, the aqueduct built in the northern forests of the city in Bahçeköy, as an integral part of this water line, was dedicated by the Sultana to his mother. This dedication reveals more openly the involvement of the Sultana, of the Queen Mother, in the construction of this infrastructure. Regarding the square fountains, a noteworthy development materialized in 1780 when the Princess Esma Sultan, daughter of Ahmet III, introduced a highly innovative urban concept by integrating water and prayer. This was achieved by incorporating a namazgah, an open-air prayer platform, on top of the fountain structure. The inscription likens its 2 fountains to wings, suggesting that during the prayer, worshippers would metaphorically ascend to the sky. Considering the swift ritual movements of the Islamic prayer, the Baroque spectacularization of the city, and the idea of motion in the urban space seems to have been already metabolized by the Ottomans in this small yet meaningful urban structure. For comparison, here are some of the previous prayer platforms which were traditionally placed at the ground level, and the new type known thereafter as Fevkani Namazgah. Following the example of 1780, numerous square fountains with prayer platforms proliferated around the city, built by female but also male patrons. I hereupon argue that, contrary to previous assumptions, surprise, surprise, women patrons were not solely passive adherents to emerging urban concept initiated by their male counterparts, but rather they also served as active decision makers, and in today's terms as trendsetters of urban phenomena. If Saliha Sultan could appear to have mostly embraced novelties emanating from the realm of male patronage, so to say, Esma Sultan's work was certainly suggested a radical conceptual innovation which left a lasting impact on subsequent constructions. In other words, we must stop ignoring the novelties coming from women. These novelties happened without waiting a man's famous first step. I will finish with this complex to which my chapter is going to be dedicated. The female avant-garde in urban matters found its utmost expression in the Mihri Shah Sultan complex at Julius Yolu in Eyüp district. Built between 1792 and 96 by the mother of Selim III. This lavish complex has attracted surprisingly poor scholarly attention, especially regarding its urban aspects. Comprising solely civic buildings, a notable innovation within the complex is the absolute prominence given to the public kitchen with annexed facilities. The biggest building is the kitchen. Thus, it can be regarded as an example of architecture of social assistance, a concept central to coeval Italy and other parts of the Western Europe of the Enlightenment. The elaborate tomb of the Sultana is situated at the left, while a water building at the right, all of them aligned along Julius Yolu, the Coronation Street. This street connects the Eyüp Sultan Mosque, the holiest place of Istanbul, where the new sultan received a symbolic sword, to Bostancı Pier. Therefore, this street hosted the most important imperial processions of the whole state. However, despite its significant role in the urban ceremonial, it lacked a proper architectural definition or monumental character before the completion of the Mihrişah Sultan complex. In a strategic move a few years later, the Sultana extended her complex by adding a primary school to the opposite side of the street, thereby reinforcing her impact from both social and urban perspectives. Through this complex, Mihrişah Sultan orchestrated the creation of the first rectilinear monumental artery of the Ottoman Istanbul, resulting from one single architectural operation. In doing so, she anticipated by several decades the interventions of the 19th century. The pioneering intention was subsequently pursued by other notable figures, including also men, like Hüsrev Pasha, who continued the construction of the eastern section of the street following the same principles. Similar to Saliha, also Mihrişah Sultan played a highly active role in the urban development of the city, extending her influence to include infrastructural projects. Concurrently with the construction of her complex in Eyüp, she commissioned a dam in Bahçeköy, aptly named as Valide Dam. The impact of the Mihrişah Sultan complex resonated in following works such as the Nakşidi Sultan complex, commissioned by Mahmud II's mother in 1817, and in various other sultanic projects in the subsequent decades. The examples I have mentioned so far allow us to reconsider the urban and architectural history of the 18th century Istanbul in a new light, like the name of the session says, and to better appreciate the role of its female patrons in the building and socio-cultural dynamics of the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Alper. Next, we have Hannah Maudsley and Eleanor Harding, who are going to present from a different part of the world, unpicking the evidence of Elizabeth Murray's role in the expansion of Ham House. They are from the National Trust, UK.
I'd like to echo everyone's thanks that's already been said. Thank you so much to our fantastic organisers and our very talented fellow speakers. After dinner one day in 1678, diarist John Evelyn visited Ham House near London. He later wrote in his diary, I walked to Ham to see the house and garden of the Duke of Lauderdale, which is indeed inferior to few of the best villas in Italy itself. The house is furnished like a great prince's. Evelyn's admiring endorsement neglected to recognise a key fact, that Ham House was the home and equally the creation of Lauderdale's wife, Elizabeth Murray. Countess of Dysart in her own right, Elizabeth possessed a title and inherited the Ham estate from her parents, who had been loyal courtiers to the king and queen. Elizabeth and her second husband became Duchess and Duke of Lauderdale together in 1672 and extended the house. However, Elizabeth's influence on Ham's architecture and interiors has been largely obscured by her husband, John Maitland, the Duke of Lauderdale, which has reflected traditional assumptions of male agency in the reading of historical sources. However, if we look beyond formal written sources and read Elizabeth into the architectural spaces at Ham, a more balanced picture of agency in architecture in the 17th century emerges.
But before Hannah expands on that, I just wanted to share with you some process. So Hannah and I are curators, which you could also call public historians, for the house that Hannah has just been describing. We have 130,000 people visit us every year, and we communicate with them through texts of 60 words or less at a reading age that we try to pitch at 12 years old. So we really hear and value that kind of call to resist the disconnected, episodic, particularist, individual narrative, but we also really know the power of that for our visitors, and telling the story of a named woman with a face that they can recognize. We see our visitors really respond to that. So the last 2 days have been absolutely amazing for broadening our sense of how we should reconsider Elizabeth's role in the development of Ham, and how we might re-examine the kind of curatorial and academic assessment so far of how she has contributed to the house. But we do need to do that sort of hand in hand with telling really compelling personal stories. Our work so far for this piece of kind of re-examining the stories that we currently tell has included a historiographical survey, of course, and I wanted to point to a few of the places that we found really helpful. So Anne Lawrence wrote an excellent essay on women and 17th century building in England, and it really offered a signpost to us because it called out that really high burden of proof that you are required to provide when you are seeking to read women's influence into the design and construction of buildings. We also found Helen Hills's work on theorizing relationships between architecture and gender extremely useful to suggest ways of re-examining the evidence that we have. And Shelley, your chapter on did women design and build before the industrial age has been extremely helpful in demonstrating that context and contemporary examples of other women involved in building could shine a light on how we interpret Elizabeth's role. And so in light of that identification of common characteristics among women recognized to be amateur architects or involved in building, we have been searching for evidence of commonality or difference in Elizabeth's experience. Some of that's really easy to find. So, we have evidence of her education in the sciences and humanities. A famed detractor of hers, who really didn't like her, had to admit that she had studied not only divinity and history, but also mathematics and philosophy. But other shared characteristics have been more difficult to trace. We don't have any inventory, for example, of the books that Elizabeth had access to prior to her marriage to her second husband. But we do know that architectural treatises and drawings were present at Ham as part of his library from the 1680s onward, 80s onwards. So the discussion of the last 2 days around things like network theory, those intellectual and social communities that women were moving in, and also the problematization of compartmentalizing roles into, whether it's architect or patron or matron, has given us lots to go away with and reconsider as we finalize our work.
I've written out the man and replaced it with two versions of the same woman. We do have written evidence of Elizabeth's architectural involvement at Ham during the expansion of the house in the 1670s. Bills for work signed by Elizabeth's hand have traditionally highlighted her role in interacting with embroiderers, tapestry makers, and cabinet makers. However, bills signed in her hand also included the key trades involved in the execution of architectural interiors, such as joiners, carvers, gilders, scagliola makers, and plasterers. This agency mirrored her mother, Catherine, who had similarly signed off bills for payment in earlier works at Ham in the 1630s. We also have written evidence of her corresponding with architects on designs. However, it's the evidence between the lines that solidifies our perception of Elizabeth's agency in the architecture and interiors at Ham. Documentary evidence also reinforces the agency that Elizabeth wielded over her two successive husbands. Bishop Gilbert Bennet wrote that she took upon her to determine everything. And her first husband, Lionel Talmash, advised his son of the dangers of letting a wife get the reins in her own hands. Our knowledge of Elizabeth as a highly educated, clever, and politically astute woman also reinforces her decision-making agency. She was an heir, not just a daughter. She had shown herself to be politically agile and bold, maintaining good relations with Oliver Cromwell, whilst at the same time carrying secret letters to and from the continent in aid of the restoration of the monarchy. The scale of her involvement is shown in her reward on Charles II's accession, with an impressive pension of £800 a year, around £160,000 a year today, for her services. Alongside the porous reality of married women's legal status at this time, this knowledge of her character sits at odds with an assumption of male agency relating to the architectural developments at Ham. However, it is the act of reading Elizabeth into the architectural spaces at Ham that really underlines her agency. The large number and the high status of spaces that form part of the 1670s extension and that focus on her bring her influence to the fore. Her private chambers were designed with an access door onto her own private gardens. She had a still house where she oversaw the making of medicines and treatments for the whole household. This has a colonnaded portico and a marble floor that echoes that of the great entrance hall. She had one of the earliest purpose-built bathrooms installed indoors near her bedchamber. What woman doesn't want an ensuite? She also had a bathhouse installed for the use of her servants, not content with her being clean. She wanted everyone being clean. And finally, the interiors too reflect Elizabeth's agency in the architecture and design of Ham House. Elizabeth's rooms mirrored the interiors of a suite of rooms she created for Queen Catherine of Braganza's use. The Queen was her friend, not her husband's. Impressive ceiling paintings by Italian muralist Antonio Verrio, for example, appear in both Elizabeth and the Queen's rooms, but none of the Duke's or shared spaces. The focus of spaces designed for her use in the extension emphasises a far greater balance of agency in shaping the built environment at Ham than the written sources might suggest.
And so with that, it's really only to say thank you all again. It's been a really fantastic couple of days. You can see from the way we've had to rewrite our piece several times that you've all been hugely influential, and we look forward to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah and Eleanor. Next, we have Mercedes Sima Lopez, who is going to speak on Elizabeth Farnese, builder of the Majesty of Philip V. Mercedes is from the University of Jaén.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the organizer, Sally Roth, Francesca Riccardo, Consuelo Lollobrigida, for her kind invitation to participate in this project and to be here with you today. During the last few years, the figure of Elisabetta Farnese is being revisited by historians and art historians, contextualizing the important political, diplomatic, and artistic role she played during the reign of Philip V. Unfortunately, little by little, historiography is leaving behind the black legend that had been built around her figure. An example of this is the title of the book published in 1892 by Edward Armstrong, Elizabeth Farnes, The Termagant of Spain, La Arpía Española. Thanks to her good conversation skills, her extensive intellectual training, as evident by her library of 8,000 volumes, her taste for literature, music, and the fine arts, and her excellent hunting skills, like you can see here, the new queen quickly hit it off with Philip V and immediately played a fundamental role in the functioning of the court, helping to build a solid image of the monarch's majesty and sometimes taking the reins of government when the king suffered severe crises of melancholy. In short, we are talking about 55 years of actions, suggestions, and influence that demonstrate the concerns and skills of a sovereign who ensured that the Spanish court had emblematic buildings designed and decorated by some of the most representative artists of the time, and which effectively conveyed the magnificence of the monarchy. The correspondence of the royal family and of the various artists and ambassadors, and the payment documents preserved in Spanish and Italian archives have allowed us to know in details these initiatives. For the Queen, for example, the Farnese Court and the palace in which she lived during her childhood and youth, like Parma and Colorno, always constitute a reference for an artistic and cultural point of view, as well as in the terms of the functioning of a court, especially during her first years as queen. Throughout her reign, Elisabetta Farnese tried to provide the various palaces of the monarchy with the proper decorum and magnificence, aware of the importance of his aspect for the international diffusion of the image of the Spanish court. Not in vain, shortly after Elisabetta Farnese arrived at the court, the French minister Horry already assured that she could gladly devote herself to the details of the buildings, furniture, and things of this nature. His estimation was more accurate, since we know numerous news confirming the Queen's taste for intervening and personally controlling the works that were done in the royal sites, both for decorative reasons and for other more pragmatic ones, such as training to avoid the attacks of depression that Philip V suffered recurrently, and that often prevent him from exercising the government and deeply modified the development of the court ceremonial. On most of the royal sites, reforms and improvements were undertaken in order to alleviate the neglect and lack of magnificence they suffered, since during the last few years, either works had begun but not had been complete, as in the case of the Royal Alcazar, or they still maintained the decoration of the reign of Charles II, since during the War of Succession, the Crown destined the bulk of its resources to defeat the Archduke. The first interventions were aimed at adapting the various residents inherited from the Habsburgs to the new needs of ceremonial and Bourbon etiquette, and to provide them with the necessary magnificence, as was the case with the Royal Alcázar of Madrid, the official palace of the king, and the Buen Retiro Palace. Many of these interventions were personally supervised by Elisabetta Farnese, who, due to her artistic training and personal interest in this type of matters, ensured that the French taste that has been dominated until then in architecture and palace decoration since the arrival of the first sovereign of the House of Bourbon in Spain, gradually lost strength in favor of Italian artistic and solutions, also introducing a taste for the Oriental. Also, from 1620, the kings began to build a building that could serve as a palace of retreat in La Granja de San Ildefonso, Segovia, where they moved after the abdication to the monarch in 1724. After the death of Louis I, 1 year later, in 1725, and the return to the throne of Philip V that same year, the building became the royal palace and, over time, one of the most emblematic buildings of the reign, in whose designs and decoration, with paintings acquired here in Rome from the hands of Carlo Maratta and sculptures that had belonged to Cristina de Suedia. The correspondence that Elisabetta Farnese kept with her parents in Parma includes interesting details about the interventions that were made in the building, and later has been preserved, in which the sovereign brutally told her mother that there was a unique room in the palace, which had been a fantasy of hers that Andrea Procaccini had transferred to paper, consisting of a room with the walls covered with different Spanish marble, which she thought were very beautiful, and with painting on the upper part and on the ceiling, as well as a fountain and a marble pavement. Years later, the renovation for the palace by Filippo Juvara, with the creation of a splendid facade in the garden and a large gallery exalting the king's exploits, constitute other important episode in the history of this building, where Elisabetta Fornese residence after being widowed between 1747 and 1758. The creation of the new room of the Infante Don Luis in El Buen Retiro Palace under the supervision of the Queen, as well as the different projects of reform of the palace after the fire of the Alcázar, once it became the official residence of the monarch in 1734, constitute another interesting topic, which for time reason I only mention. Years later, when in 1738 works were carried on in the Queen's room at El Escorial, Elisabetta Fornese gave precise instruction to suspend the reform until she personally moved to the monastery, and once here, she would determine what should be done. And as soon as she was widowed, Elisabetta Fornese continued to show her good taste for architecture. First, with the reform of the Palace of Los Afligidos in Madrid, where she settles with her young children in 1746 after the 1746 after the death of Philip V, and later with the construction of the Palace of Rio Frio, destined to the Infante Cardenal Don Luis, and the conclusion of the works of the Palace of San Ildefonso, where she resided between 1747 and 1758. Without forgetting how after the death of Fernando VI in 1758, she returned to Madrid as Queen Governor and took numerous decisions in relation to the royal palace and the Buen Retiro until the arrival of his son, the new King Charles III of Spain. I hope I have conveyed to you the importance of this sovereign, undoubtedly a builder of the Philip I majesty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mercedes. Next, we have Priscilla Saunier, noble-minded sister, Griselda Stevens, and Dublin Stevens Hospital, 1717 to 1733. Priscilla is from the University College, Dublin. Wonderful. And I'd just like to thank, as everyone has before, our organizers for inviting us here to speak in such amazing and gorgeous environs in Rome. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So placed over the entrance and east gate of Dr. Stevens Hospital, Dublin, on a granite tablet stone and gold lettering, this inscription here recognizes the contributions of the late Dr. Richard Stevens and his sister Griselda, who devoted her life and fortune to building the hospital and overseeing its charitable endeavors.
This prominent dedication, which included the role of a patroness in the building's completion, was not only significant for the period, but also within the cultural context of Irish improvement, as in Griselda Stevens' exceptional roles in the hospital's construction and fundraising significantly influenced male and female patterns of charitable behavior in Dublin thereafter. Following the death of Dr. Stevens in 1710, his, quote, noble-minded sister, Griselda, was extremely desirous to see her brother's good intentions for a hospital in Dublin carried out in her lifetime, and generously surrendered the possessions of her estate to facilitate the construction of a, quote, fair and convenient hospital for the reception of persons laboring under curable distempers. From 1717, Mrs. Stevens' charity oversaw the construction, furnishing, and management of the hospital, which provided for the maintenance and cure of 300 sick persons and the wounded curable poor of this kingdom. Indeed, until her death at the age of 93 in 1796, Stevens remained wholeheartedly committed to charitable improvements and construction undertaken at the hospital, as she resided for several years in the apartments reserved for her in the hospital from 1733 to 1746, giving her time and talents which were of a high order to the management and construction of the institution. For the purposes of this brief roundtable talk, Stevens' role in contributing and fundraising £16,000 for the building of the hospital from 1717 until 1734, her management of the hospital's construction, appointment of male trustees to her charity to assist with the project, as well as her additional bequeathment that provided, quote, all things necessary for the entertainment of 46 persons, which she was pleased to personally maintain and provide for during her life, will be discussed through the narrative structure of her 1741 portrait by Irish artist Michael Mitchell to reveal unique insights into her legacy as an architectural patron. Crucially, Griselda's matronage of Dr. Stevens Hospital in the early 18th century also reflects what Irish medical historian Shane Brady described in 1865 as the time when a noble Christian movement for the establishment of charitable and medical hospitals was commenced in Ireland. Stevens' actions of Christian generosity, which ameliorated the lives of the poor within the context of sociocultural improvement during the formative years of the Irish ascendancy period, provided an example for later generations of elite Irishmen to support building projects that aligned with gendered sensibilities, such as assisting the poor, penitent, or the orphaned. Significantly, 18th and 19th century literature emphasizes the role of Griselda over that of Dr. Stevens in building the hospital, as she independently bequeathed her fortune to support her brother's memory, which subsequently influenced other members of the Irish elite to support her charitable endeavors. Likewise, it is also important to recognize Stevens' gendered status as an independently wealthy and unmarried woman during the period, as her wealth and connections significantly enabled her to operate within male-dominated spheres and influence elite patterns of behavior in Ireland throughout the 18th century. Mitchell's portrait, which was commissioned by the male hospital's governors in 1741, narratively reflects her instrumental role in what the 11th of January 1734 edition of the Dublin Journal described as so pious a design. Although there is no evidence of Stevens' likeness by Michael Mitchell being published or collected in print during the period, illustrations of the hospital, in the corner here, were included in popular works such as Robert Poole and John Cash's Views of the Most Remarkable Buildings, Monuments, and Other Edifices in the City of Dublin from 1780, which were strongly associated with her charitable and financial legacy. Poole and Cash's views, which were supported by subscriptions from the Irish elite, is particularly noteworthy, as Dr. Stevens Hospital was one of 20 public buildings chosen to represent Dublin in its, quote, present state of improvement as the second city in the British Dominions. Purposely written and illustrate to reflect how industry, the polite arts, and architecture have again flourished in Ireland, views included collectible engravings, as well as short descriptions of the buildings and their respective architects and patrons. Significantly, the accompanying entry for the hospital and views does not mention an architect. Instead, it provides a biography of its benefactress, who was, quote, desirous to see her brother's intentions executed. Indeed, Griselda's unique role in building the hospital is emphasized throughout Poul & Cash's volume, acknowledging her agency in purchasing the land at the end of James's Street, where it now stands, in addition to her influence in society that provided considerable bequests and benefactions which enabled her to complete the building and construction. Her actions from 1717 to 1734, which allowed for the hospital to open, preface a brief explanation of a 1730 Act of Parliament, which appointed 23 governors and their successors to be a body politic and corporate forever. This is particularly important as the act was only achieved through Griselda's patronage support for the building, its affiliated charity, and her subsequent management of it. In this capacity, her biography and the engraving of the hospital reflected in her architectural and philanthropic legacy in Dublin was long recognized by the Dublin's elite by 1780 when Views was published, and even earlier when the hospital's governors commissioned her portrait in 1741 for the same purpose. The portrait, which was completed when Griselda was 88 years old, distinctively operated to reflect her crucial role in the hospital's transition from an architectural concept to a functional and philanthropic working space. For a contemporary and largely male audience within the hospital, this was displayed in the Dr. Worth Library, which is where the surgeons all met, and it was an exclusively male space. Her image would have kind of symbolically overseen their meetings within. She's holding the display of the east front elevation in her right hand, which would have been the public face of the hospital, communicating her roles privately and publicly in overseeing the hospital's construction and in addition to its development in her brother's memory. Considering that the portrait was commissioned by the hospital's Board of Governors, an institution to which Stevens herself was prohibited by virtue of her sex, the historically masculine conventions of this mode of representation, women, or really historically men holding architectural plans or calipers, is particularly significant here, as this representation was arguably adapted to acknowledge her role in this capacity by advancing the socioeconomic welfare of the city as a female patron within a masculine meeting space. Likewise, this elevation was crucial to defining visual meaning for those within the hospital, as the library was located in the northeast projection on the first floor and near Stevens' domestic apartments. As the portrait was displayed within the interior of the design represented, and more specifically in a space designated for men who were either improving the hospital as doctors or governors, it should be recognized that Stevens' likeness emblematically provided purpose for everyone's actions within the library and indeed within the hospital itself. And in conclusion, while the drawing of the East Front can objectively represent the sociocultural benefit of the welfare of Dublin's poor, it also reflects Stevens' evolution as the hospital's benefactress who conceptualized its building, oversaw its construction, inscribed her name upon its gates, and lived to see her portrait displayed upon its walls. Thank you.
Our final speaker for the roundtable will be Julie Beckers, whose presentation is entitled Rebuilding for Observance, Architectural Changes to Santa Maria de Monteluce in Perugia, Post-Reform, circa 1448 to 1485. Julie is from the University of Leuven.
Hello. Since I'm the penultimate speaker, I feel that I should again thank you all and a lot. Shali, the organizers of this sunny Reuben conference. I had a lot of fun meeting colleagues and finding out about the ongoing issues regarding women as actors in the cultural fabric of our global past. I think that's a nice sentence. So my very brief pitch, and I promise really not to keep you long, It's very relaxed. We'll consider my research on the convent of Santa Maria di Monteluce in Perugia on the Italian peninsula. And specifically for this occasion, the changes that occurred in the build structure of the convent after the reform of 1448. And I say specifically for this occasion because I'm an art historian and not at all an architectural historian. I know a wolf in sheep's clothing among you. Monteluce, however, offers a good case for architectural historians, and it equally offers a splendid case for women's agency. It is a story of powerful abbesses who made independent decisions about their own visual surroundings. This research grew from my PhD, which dealt with the broader visual culture of several Poor Clare convents on the Italian peninsula, connected through a complicated network of reform. I specifically studied Poor Clare institutions in central and southern Italy, Perugia and Napoli, between the period 1350 and 1525, roughly. And not to sound like a bookseller, but my book will be out next year, 2025, published by Brepels. Very exciting. Well, I think so. So Santa Maria di Monteluce in Perugia, the hilltop capital of the Umbrian region in central Italy, was founded in 1218 and is the third oldest community of Poor Clares outside of San Damiano, the HQ of the Second Order of Franciscans. And here you see a 19th century photograph of the convent and a recent one. The facade in local Pietra Rossa stone is retained and shows most of its original features. The inside of the convent, however, has suffered much damage, and it has been turned into a polyclinic around 1910 when the nuns left the premises and moved to a nearby building. And then since 2010, the site has been subject to new urban development offering social housing and community spaces. But the lay church on the left and the nuns' choir, containing an important early 14th century fresco cycle, remain relatively intact. Monteluce was a wealthy establishment, attracting elite girls carrying substantial dowries when they entered a strictly enclosed convent. Names such as Deotti, Alfani, Baioni were welcomed among the numbers of a growing flock of nuns. And this wealth, as you can see, resulted in the huge size of its territory, here marked by a red line only an art historian and not an architectural historian could insult you with. In fact, the substantial physical and documentary evidence that survives for this convent is our richest source of information for understanding the architectural and decorative practices of observant Clarissa during the 15th and 16th centuries. Monteluce was reformed in 1448 and therefore entered the observant family led by charismatic reformers such as Bernardino da Siena and Giovanni da Capistrano in the mid-15th century. Reform was deemed necessary when religious communities had developed a lax attitude towards their monastic principles. Scandalous behavior, for example, could lead to a need for reform. Yet, saucy scandals were something for the Venetian convents. At Monteluce, the principal reason for reform was a return to clausura, or enclosure, the need for nuns to remain hidden behind the high walls of the convent. And as Hofmann has recently commented, clausura structured the spatial perception of nuns, oriented their gaze and limited their horizon, and in this way shaped their activities, including spiritual and cultural production. An elaborate birdcage, let's say, with far-reaching consequences, consequences that lead to isolation, yet also consequences that carried opportunities for patronage. Though decided by the ecclesiastical authorities, the actual act of reform was mainly performed by the nuns themselves. The reform of Monteluce has been described in detail in the Chronicle of Monteluce by Battista Alfani, one of those powerful abbesses I mentioned. On the 21st of December, 1448, 24 nuns from the nearby convent of Santa Lucia in Foligno arrived in an elaborate reform procession. The reforming abbess Margarita da Sulmona, aided by her vicar Cecilia Coppoli, retrieved the keys and seal of Monteluce from Abbess Nicolosa da Francesco Deoti. The nuns then vanished behind the high walls of the convent, and to put it very plainly, reform had commenced. The consequences of reform were twofold, and this is something for the architectural historians, plan. So they were twofold. There were spiritual and intellectual consequences, such as the initiation of a chronicle and the development of new spiritual exercises. And there were also visual and architectural consequences. For example, the commission of Raphael that was later stolen by Napoleon, brought back to Italy by Canova, and then kept by the Pope here in Rome. Talk about naughty men. But for the purpose of this brief pitch and the essay that we're all industriously writing, I focus on the architectural changes at Monteluce post-reform, mostly initiated by Margarita da Sulmona and Cecilia Coppoli. And these changes, as noted by the chronicle written by the nuns, but also by the illustrious file number 44 in the archive in Perugia, detailing entrata e uscita, income and outgoings, can be small physical rearrangements, such as the need to mortar up an old door or the importance of a grate dividing the lay church from the nuns' choir. Yet the sources also include bigger building works pertaining to reform and equally noted as decisions taken by Margarita da Sulmona, such as the creation of a communal dormitory as opposed to the single cells the nuns had been enjoying, or the creation of a collective garden instead of individual plots of land owned by individual nuns. And most importantly, as you can see here on the slide as one example, the vaulting of the nuns' choir. And this vaulting signified a true return to clausura in the space the nuns frequented most during their devotional activities, the choir. Through the vaulting, the connection between choir and lay church was almost completely lost, apart from a small opening in the shared wall that could be covered up with cloth, therefore enhancing this idea of clausura that was so important for observant reform. So by focusing on the voices of the scribe in the chronicle and the vicar in file 44, the agency of Margarita da Sulmona and Cecilia Coppoli as reforming abbesses will surface in a humble yet quietly powerful way. Thank you.
Well, this concludes the presentation part of our roundtable. And I'd like to ask the speakers to come and sit in the chairs that we have up here up front. And once everyone's seated, we'll begin with our discussion. No, I'm not sitting. Yeah. Okay. So you see, just 1 minute. What I'll try to do in this discussion is tie in the two problems that I presented in the beginning to the two areas of research that we have here. We're going to do it in a little bit different order, but we will start in a sense with the first three speakers, which we have Margaret, Giotti, and Alper. Is Giotti online? I want to make sure that she's there for, hi Giotti. You'll need to unmute your mic so that if you want to join in.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you. Wonderful. So first, I wanted to address something that in the beginning I thought had been somewhat little studied, but definitely not. And that is women's impact on public space, women's influence in shaping the design of cities and creating what Didi Fairchild Ruggles has called synecdoches, or representations of themselves in public space, is an idea that's been worked on simultaneously by many other scholars, such as Fairchild Ruggles in the Islamic world, Martinez Lopez for ancient Rome, and later by D. Senokak for Ottoman Istanbul. Of course, I could list many more. These are just the highlights that I chose to present here. For early modern Europe, we have Sarah Galetti's work, most specifically her 2012 article in the Journal of Architectural Historians on female agency and early modern urbanism, the Paris of Marie de Medici. So we do have scholars working on how women, what their motivation is in patronage and how they represent themselves within the public sphere. We also have in our 3 presentations today examples of women who are attempting to do this very thing. One thing that I was thinking about that we haven't talked about too much is understanding the impact that these women may have had in their own time, in the sense of, do we have documentation? Is it possible to show how their work was received, if it was talked about at all in their time? And the reason that I ask this is we're looking at the ancient Roman period. We're looking at the Mughals in India, in which there's no written word about them. And then, of course, we're looking at the Ottoman period, where the women are supposed to be somewhat invisible. And I know that we can, you know, in a sense, in looking back at history, we can look at the city plans, we can look at the architecture, we can do the analysis. And I'm curious to know, what can we know about the image that was received by the public in those historical times? Is it possible? So we begin with that. Yes, Margaret.
Mic in hand. Is this working? Yeah, okay. So I think that's a really good question, and I can answer it in a sort of straightforward way. For some of the monuments I've worked on in Rome, particularly the Porticus of Livia, for example, we have Strabo, the geographer, talking about it as one of the most beautiful buildings, and he situates it among the Porticus, the Forum of Augustus, which is just emerging at this time, and other major imperial commissions that are happening. So, that's sort of imperial propaganda, if you will, right? So it's beautiful. It's great. What I think is a little more interesting is the way that the historical activities around them and the actions and the things that happen to them are in a sense a text in their own right. I kind of think of these buildings as their own kinds of texts and the things that happen to them. And so, I mean, one of the points that I maybe didn't convey as clearly as I could is that, that dismantling that happens of Agrippina's great work at the hand of her son is a kind of reception, right? It's a way of making clear that it was not well received by at least her son. Despite the fact that it's an imperial commission, it's a cult temple for an emperor who has been deified. So I think in some ways there's a body of literature in my field which talks about how we do have to read different kinds of texts and read between the lines, which is something you sort of referred to, because often words in literature doesn't line up with the materiality of the world that's being created by women.
Mm-hmm. Jyoti.
Yeah, I would actually answer your questions by referring to the map of the city where these mosques are located. These mosques are still surviving in Delhi today, so they are very much a part of the city. So the earliest detailed map that we have of Delhi is from the mid-19th century, which shows the mosques that I'm going to discuss, that the ones that I presented, very prominently on the map. So a reading of the map indicates that while we may not have any written records that tell us how these sites were selected, but these are apart from the Jami Masjid, which the emperor built himself. these are probably the most important sites in the city. So therefore, the women have some agency, I would believe, or I would like to postulate, in asserting themselves in deciding where they want these mosques to be built. Now, as far as the public reception of these buildings is concerned, given the size and the scale and the placement of these mosques in the overall hierarchy, it would be fairly reasonable to assume that these were very, very prominent places of worship. In fact, a reading of the city plan would also kind of reveal that their location is along the two most important streets of the city. So they are at virtually at the termination point of one street and located at a midpoint on the other street. So the mosques typically in a Mughal city were also the nuclei of the neighborhood. So therefore, they are kind of dictating in a way how the city is going to grow in terms of the infill. And there are passing references to the mosques in the 17th century itself by court chroniclers, but the court chroniclers are all men, and typically they are extolling the Jami Masjid, calling it the mosque of the world and all of that. But these mosques are
They don't
mentioned
the beggar.
only in passing. But I would like to say that once the records begin to become available to us following the occupation of Delhi by the British, in the late 18th and early 19th century, these mosques are a rallying point for the city's Muslim population, which is now under British control. And in 1857, which is like a watershed year in the history of India, it marks the year of the uprising, Indian uprising against colonial rule. These were the mosques from where a lot of the angst was kind of perpetrated. So, and there is also an afterlife of these mosques, in the sense that I would like to kind of argue and say that given this kind of collective patronage of these mosques in Delhi, in the 18th century, we have a similar kind of exercise being undertaken in a faraway place within the Indian subcontinent, in a place called Murshidabad, by the Begums of Murshidabad. But they are not as big or as ornate or as splendid as the Delhi mosques, but certainly it's an endeavor. And following that, in the early 19th century, we have a similar exercise being undertaken by a group of mosques in the princely state of Bhopal.
Yes, I think your first point is very relevant. The fact that historical maps are a kind of evidence, because they do have a cultural perspective that's imbued in them, the way that they're drawn, the things that are selected, the things that are left out. And in addition to the many different ways that you've demonstrated that one can understand the reception, Alper, how might you respond to this?
Well, my case is very fortunate because 18th century Istanbul was a place of a turbulent innovation, and people acknowledge it as such. So they acknowledged all the architectural and urban and artistic novelty going on in the city, both locals and travelers coming to the Ottoman Empire. So we have quite an extensive acknowledgement by both foreigners and locals. In the case of, for example, I didn't include it, but while Mir Shah Sultan was doing this big civic complex, actually, and she was the queen mother, the princess Hatice Sultan, so the sister of the same sultan, she started working with an architect from Lorraine, Antoine Ignace Melling, and she commissioned the first completely European palace on Bosphorus on a commissioned by an Ottoman. And we have the daily correspondences between Antoine Ignace Melling and Hatice Sultan. Like, it's incredibly detailed how she says, no, I don't like this, I like rather that, etc., etc. And once her palace was done, everybody, all the following patrons who wanted luxurious mansions on the waterfronts of Istanbul, they really asked for a palace like that of Esma Sultan, that of Hatice Sultan. She really set a trend.
Right.
So it was acknowledged, and also the public visibility of the 18th century. Now it's quite a hot topic in the Ottomanist world. The Ottoman women in the 18th century, they started claiming the right to attend mosques for the first time in the Islamic world. So a regular Ottoman citizen in the 18th century saw much more ladies than compared to previous centuries. So this brought along both a recognition of the female's role in the city, positively and negatively, because then you have all a set of men complaining about seeing so many women around. So, I mean, acknowledged, yes, positively, but sometimes also negatively, but
Right.
documents. These are
Absolutely.
documents for historians. So yeah, both. I would say absolutely yes in my case.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer, because the next topic that I want to segue into is for our next 4 authors who are doing more private or religious type of architecture. And yet what we'd like to discuss also relates to our first 3 speakers, which is this whole question of authorship. I know that in earlier scholarship, often the assumption was that women who were patrons just paid for the work. And yet there was a lot of discussion of authorship for male patrons as to what the degree of their involvement in the project was. And this has now become an issue when we talk about authorship for women. What degree is the patron involved? She hands off and just signs the bills, or is she actually involved in the design? Is she managing the financial accounts? And this may differ between a queen who has many responsibilities, and yet so interesting to see their deep involvement, versus an elite woman who perhaps is just managing a home or something like that. It is a little different. But what I would like to hear from the authors is their perception of the degree to which their patron is involved in the work, and the degree to which they think that, let's say, had an impact on the architecture itself or the interior design. Just a few comments here and there, and especially from Julie, who's working with nuns. And it's different from being a patron, but they were quite influential in their desires for creating this reformed environment.
I thank you for that question. I think you're right with nuns. It's really very specific, so I can't stress enough the importance of clausura. So the fact that nuns had to be unseen at all times, but they had to be seen in a sort of way. For example, in my case, the nuns' choir was actually right behind the shared altar wall. And the point was that you would have a small opening through which the lay community could hear the nuns sing. And depending on how good the singing was, patrons were attracted to come to the convent. So it was almost as if the architecture of that shared altar wall and this nuns' choir, where it was located, attracted more patronage from males, probably, to the convent. So it's a very individual sort of design, because at the same time, they had to make these changes, in my case, due to reform. And we know from the Chronicle, for example, the most important source, that those women themselves made those decisions because men were just not allowed into the enclosure. So you see things in the convent popping up like Margarita da Sulmona, the reforming abbess, has decided to make that wall higher, so it sort of changes our movement through the spaces of the convent. So there it's really the voices of the women who spoke. And even with, and this is not architecture, but even with the commissioning of, for example, this Raphael for the lay church, this was outside. They were not seeing this altarpiece at all, but they were the ones who decided what colors were used, which artists was going to be picked. But of course, they needed the male intermediaries to do their business outside their invisible city, this term coined by Helen Hills. I think that's, so on the inside, these were invisible cities that were as much cities on the outside, completely working farms and all of that needed to be structured. But I would say by women, because men were just not allowed to go in there. So perhaps nuns were giving more opportunity to be patrons or matrons in their own right.
Yes, and this, because you're talking about women who are enclosed, this makes me think of Jyoti and her Begum women. And I know that's an impossible question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Since there's no records left of them, I would wonder if there's any way to ever perceive a particular woman's influence on the mosques that built from any perspective, maybe not, but also they also lived in an enclosed space. And although there are no written records, I wonder if anyone has studied the spaces they may have lived in and perhaps how they might have had some impact on that. Jyoti.
Yeah, so, like I mentioned in my opening slide, the women, because they were not, they were invisibilized, so therefore, there's not much that got written about them during the 17th century. The invisibilization actually was not there initially, because if you look at the Mughal dynasty, in what's called the early years of the Mughal dynasty, the women were very, very powerful matriarchs who were also traveling to Makkah for Hajj, believe it or not. And this institutionalization of how women should lead their lives in parda, behind a veil, happens during the reign of Akbar onwards. And the idea of veiling women was actually born from the need to project the women as okay. So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I think there's something went wrong. So, the idea of projecting the elite women, and particularly in the context of the Mughals, as being very, very virtuous and therefore not open to the public, was born in the 16th century, and thereafter the veiling of women began. Am I audible?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, so therefore we find that, and this is particularly true only for elite women, because women who belonged to the lower strata of the social ladder did not necessarily have to be in veil. So, and because of the veiling, the access to the women's quarters was a complete no-no. So the accounts of how these women, there are some eyewitness accounts of how these women lived from English women visitors who visited them following colonization, and there is a lot of what one would call the bazaar gossip, where very lurid accounts of these women are painted, and especially by men who are ascribing to them all kinds of vices. And if we look at it in terms of scholarship, till about the late 1880s or even 1990s, the lives of the women behind these closed walls continued to be caricaturized, where the scholars, men in particular, tended to use the same kind of language that was used during the colonial tropes, so to speak. And it is only fairly recently that new perspective of how these women lived their lives behind these closed walls have begun to emerge. So there are scholars like Lal, Malhotra, then we have Bukhari, and Mukhoti. So there are fairly recently some scholars who are now beginning to unravel for us new identities for these women. And particularly, I'd like to point out, which is something that I said at the during my presentation also, that there are two, in the context of architecture, which is the subject of our symposium and the book that will follow. There are two women who kind of stand out on account of their patronage, one is Noor Jahan, and the other one is Shah Jahan's elder daughter. who also has an important bearing on the chapter that I'm going to write, which is Jahanara. So recently there has been a lot of focus on who Jahanara was, what she did, and her patronage. And also I would like to add, although I've been saying this consistently, that the women are veiled, so therefore we don't get to see who they are, where they come from. We are able to assume because of their titles. We don't know when they were born, what their actual names were. And very recently, art historians have been able to identify, and therefore, but there's still a big if, because they're not absolutely sure. They've been able to identify a portrait, a miniature, a Mughal miniature of Jahan-Ara. So they're kind of attributing it to a painter in Shah Jahan's court, and are saying this is probably the first and the only representation of what she looked like. As far as the women that I'm talking about is concerned, there are women who are, despite being very powerful, they have no voice, because like I mentioned, there is a sort of a competition between you have Jahan-Ara on one side, who is very, very powerful, and then you have these three women on the other side. So there's not much that we know about them, but certainly in terms of scholarship, how Mughal women have been constructed historically has changed. So that is what I would like to say.
I'd like to point out something that I've never connected before myself, that is of interest to the women that you study. And that is, I work on women construction laborers in the medieval and early modern period. And these women are also, in a sense, invisible and silent. The records sometimes mention their names as they are being paid daily. But at other times, they're just listed as women with no name at all. And it might be of interest for you to look at the people who have studied women in construction in these earlier periods and see what kind of sources they use and how they put the picture together, how they put the puzzle together, trying to work with women about which we know almost nothing other than their name.
Yeah, sure. That would be useful.
I'd also like to point out that we have two queens. Oh, go ahead. Yes, please.
Sorry, it's just to riff off what you were just saying. I think it's a really important point, particularly when we're considering the role of women, and it's very easy to lean into the individuals and the sort of matronage. I sort of scrawled something earlier about there being a social status element, agency, the preserve of the wealthy, labour, the preserve of the poor. And I think it's what you're saying about how we reveal those agency, that the activity of those women who weren't able to be matrons of design as some of these more elite individuals were.
Yes, and what I find interesting is that we have two queens represented, and actually empresses, and then we have nuns, and then we have elite women who are, I mean, they're lesser status than a queen, but they have wealth and they can design and build. And in all cases, we've seen that these are women who are deeply involved in their projects. They're not, the stereotype that we might expect.
Just real quickly, I wanted to ask,
yes,
the image of, was it Griselda Stevens who holds the architectural drawings?
Yes.
I mean, I think there's a way that, we may not have a piece of paper in an archive that says she knew and understood building technologies, but like the technological knowledge that these women must have had to have known, we have to make some interpretive assumptions about that.
Yeah.
Which I think, most of, architectural historical discourse has been doing, mostly written by men, about men's knowledge for centuries, right? So like those, I think, are the evidentiary pieces that can tell us, like, she probably knew what she was looking at and she probably understood, yes?
I'll just go off of that. So there's actually another portrait, not of her, but of Dr. Edward Worth, where the library hangs. Both portraits are in there. There's also a representation of the hospital in Worth's portrait. However, there's no plans. There's no really kind of technical architectural connections as you have with Griselda's portrait. And I think that's really showcasing
Yeah.
her involvement and her passion for the building process, and just how deeply involved she was from the very beginning. And she was actively also involved with its design. So it went through a number of kind of drawings and models. Unfortunately, the original model from 1718 is lost. We can only imagine what it looked like. But she is asking the male governors of her charity to actively write or do things on her behalf. And she has the support of these men to help her, and she's able to kind of get plans, get drawings, get models built, and everyone collectively together is making decisions. But at the end of the day, as you were saying, if she didn't like it, she didn't like it, and it wasn't happening.
Yes. Also, I'd like to point out that Isabel Farnese, in her portrait, she has architectural tools, kind of a little bit lower in the image there. Mercedes.
Yes, she wasn't invisible.
Yeah. Yes, she's very
Later
visible.
and silent. All the courts, all the ambassadors talk about the queen with a little bit of fear sometimes. And it's very, no, I'm joking. It's very interesting how see like drawings, sometimes make a portrait of the daughters when the girls need to get married. Call to the ambassadors, okay, please call the painters. I have no time to make a drawing, but we need quickly a portrait of my daughter find a husband. But she knows perfectly what she wants in architecture. Sometimes she uses ministers or the artists like Andrea Procaccini. I like a cabinet with mirrors painted, blah, 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 blah. Sometimes she chooses materials. For example, one of the great rooms in La Granja presented a project, and she said, okay, it's beautiful, it's interesting, but I remember we have some pieces of green marble, so I like that you use it. And also you can talk with, I don't know, and ask more materials. And I saw these colors, so she has a very, very clear idea. And also it's interesting, she of course try to get porcelains, marvelous, famous antiques. And also she is worried about to make a publication with illustration of these sculptures. And when the project is finished and she control that it is a good work, decided to cancel and introduce in the most deep part of the archive to try to anyone see this horrible description of the sculptures of La Granja. So for us, it's very important to understand his great capacity, not like designer, but marvelous director of orchestra of all the renovation of the Spanish Royal Palace.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn our conversation in a different direction now, in a sense, towards conclusion. And I want us to not only discuss amongst ourselves here, but also ask the audience to join in as they will. Please feel free to run up and grab the microphone, if you will. And in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that we need a new taxonomy, a new language, some new words to use, perhaps even ones that are contemporary, which can be difficult when applying to the historical period, but maybe we may give them new meaning by applying them in this context. These are words like the word amateur, the lover of the arts, the amateur architect, the patron architect. There are many other words that can be used to describe the different aspects of women's involvement. The word I'd like to focus on right now, just in conclusion though, is the term matronage. And that is because in English, we have both patronage and matronage. We have patron and matron, but they really mean different things. A matron would most likely be a married woman, but she could be widowed or, heaven forbid, divorced. And it doesn't necessarily imply patronage, that she's building a building, you know. Even the word matronage does not imply that in any way, but it may imply her support in some way to something going on. But I know in the different languages, the different European vernaculars, perhaps in Turkish, in the languages in India, you may use a different term and it may have different meanings. And I thought it would be very interesting with the audience that we have gathered here today to talk about the word matronage in the context of women's patronage. I'm going to leave it a little bit open-ended. Would anyone like to talk about their perspective from their language, how it's used, and you know, any debates or issues with that? Yes. On the bottom, there's a switch. It's tiny.
Yes. No, I can only, and maybe it's a funny remark, but my native language is Dutch, Flemish, and matrone is just a very angry woman. So it's a very angry woman who's also a good mother, right? So who arranges the household. But a matrone is someone that you should probably be scared of in Flanders. But I do want to point out Marilyn Dunn, I don't know whether you've read, she uses for her work on Roman matrons, and I think she uses it on the architecture of convents. And she uses it, I think, already at the end of the 1990s,
Yes.
as implying nuns being part of the architectural design of their convents. Yeah. Yes, she uses matronage.
Yes,
Yeah.
I noticed in the 90s, a favored turn of phrase that came about was matrons as patrons. Yeah, Carolyn Vallone, she entitled her article, and then it started being used for a while. But it's more, you know, pointing out that the woman was the patron, and a nice play on words there. Later, the term matronage started to crop up as, you know, should we replace the term patronage with matronage? And then it fell out of favor for a while. And now it's kind of back in the literature. That's what stimulated my thinking about this, the meaning. Yes. Albert.
Well, in Turkish is a very, compared to Indo-European languages, Turkish is very atypical because it's 100% gender neutral. Unless I don't want to say to specify the male kid and the girl kid, unless if I don't put like words male, female, etc., everything works for both genders, except for Arabic and French loanwords, which do have a gender distinction. So we would say actor and actress in Turkish. Otherwise, the Turkish version is completely neutral, oyuncu, in both cases. Curiously, for example, in the case of patrons, we really got both versions from Arabic. Bani is a male patron. Baniye is a female patron, so it's a matron. So we could distinguish if we really want to, but yeah, that's a thing which is an external thing to Turkish language. If I really want to emphasize that these were women builders, like Ottomans did, because they really used extensively the word baniye. So the builder, like building maker, let's say, because bina is building. So yeah, Turkish adopted these two loan words from Arabic really to distinguish between male and female patrons. I would add also to the vocabulary to discuss a little bit more the very term design, like which point, I mean, are there first class design decisions and second class design decisions, or are they both relevant? For example, in many cases, we know that women decided where exactly to put different buildings of a complex. In the case of Mihri Şavalide Sultan, you have seen the photo that the tomb is at the end of the street. which an architect would completely do the opposite. You would have put it at the beginning of the street like this. It's more visible from the waterfront. But this has to be 100% a decision of the patron, because she wanted to stay closer to the mosque because this was a holy site.
Yeah.
So is this a second-class decision making? I mean, we really need to articulate more the issue of what is design,
What is design? Yes.
or should we just use the words decision making instead?
Can I come in on that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'd like to advocate for professional business English. No, I mean, there are lots in the world today in terms of, you think about project management, construction management, there are so many very clearly defined roles. So to talk about a project manager, to talk about a client, to talk about an end user, and, it may be slightly ahistorical to think about it in those terms, but actually we know that, for example, in the case of Elizabeth Marriott Ham, she's working on a house that she's grown up in. She knows it so well, and she is the person who is going to live in it afterwards. And we see her living in it afterwards, moving things around, saying, actually, I don't really want my bedroom there, it turns out. I'm going to move to this room instead. And so the idea that she's not an active participant and that we can't express that through the kind of words that are used in contemporary kind of sort of efficient kind of work.
I'm almost wondering if we need an explanation of the term.
Yes.
Please. Yes.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting conversation. Yeah, I would like to highlight instead the Italian because it's, I think, a study case. We don't have matron. I mean, we have the word matron, of course, because it's a Latin word, and we use matrona in a kind of, to mean sometimes a lute woman. So it is not very positive meaning, that of matrona, or it's, but it more refers to the 50s of the 1900. Matrona was, a woman who was leading a family, taking care of children with a very strong, which was a character and very strong way of educating educating the children and leading the family. Well, we don't have the word matronage. In the very last years, we are just taking along from the other languages, from English, a little bit from Spanish. And since Haskell's, patrons and artists, we've been using a committente. So it is, it's a word which actually doesn't have a gender, but it reflects somehow, the male part of the process of the interaction between the committente, the patron, and the artist. In this case, our language is deeply patriarchal. So, and that's very interesting, because I think that this debate should really open also, for the Italian speaking, the opening box to which word we should use, because evidently, in the very last decades, we have really brought into light what women have done and the important role they played, in different regions. So now, personally, I use the word matronage with using the English accent, but evidently because I work in an English-speaking environment, so I do need to use it. But if 2 years ago, I was in a conference which was organized by Università di Macerata and Università di Genova, Le Storiche dell'Arte, that was, the topic of the conference, and we discussed about whether it was important and relevant to use the female word instead of the male words. And I probably, you remember the exhibition Artemisia Gentileschi in London, created by Treves. It was 2021. We were right at the end of the pandemic or something like that. And she, for instance, decided to title the exhibition Artemisia Gentileschi and not just Artemisia, because we had to stress out his his family name, and right away we started I mean, the few Italians were studying women artists, not to translate anymore from the English into the Italian, artiste donne, but just to say artiste, to delete the word donne. So it is the same concept that could be applied to the committenti, to the matrons, and to the artists. So I think it is a broader issue, in Italian at least. Yeah.
No, absolutely. To drop the word woman from the noun, using it as an adjective, is a bold step right there. Would anyone else like to comment from their language, the issue of matronage or design being used? Okay, nothing else? Okay, then I'm going to move forward. Oh, yes, one more. Oh, microphone. Awesome.
We also use in Dutch mecenas. I think the French probably, yeah, and men, yeah, and we also use it for females as a general. But I think that's maybe not. I mean, I have a friend who's an artist, and she's always sort of insulted when we say kunstenaar to artist. And kunstenares is the female artist, and she then feels insulted. So she would prefer it to be called kunstenaar, to have one term to signify, perhaps a bit like in Turkish, a gender neutral, yeah.
Yeah, because in Italy, many women want to be called architecto,
Yeah.
we have architecta.
Yeah, but also we used to say stewardess on the airplane, steward and stewardess, and now we say, I forget,
I mean, there's
attendant.
this is gonna throw us off on a wild tangent, but
Please do.
I mean, there's a whole philosophical tradition that looks at, you know, linguistics and language formation and how it means, and that, you know, kind of semiotic theory that looks at words like woman, which is the marked form of man, right? It's marked with a prefix WO, or the ESS on the end of benefactress tells it, you know, these markers, these linguistic markers that already embed into our practice and language coded and gendered values that we almost, I hate to say naturally, but you know, give meaning. And so, and it reminds me of, you know, this whole debate in the academy in the 80s and the 90s about whether women should use their first name on their publications or just their initials, because if they just use their initials, people might actually read their articles. But if their first name was included and it gave an indication of the fact that they were a woman, they often got overlooked, right? So, I mean, I think we've come further and we now use our first names pretty regularly. At least I do. I don't know if you, but, you know.
Yes.
As almost a kind of political act of stating, I'm part of this tradition, I'm part of this discourse, I'm part of, so, I mean, talking about whether, you know, we need to define matronage, I mean, it's already marked by the feminine, by the gendered identity, but to bring a whole positive semantic range of the gender, you know, to make it a positive word is, I think, part of the work.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
yes. Anne.
Thank you. On the podium. Don't want to stand in front of you, yeah. Like this, yeah, okay. Well, thank you all. I just wanted to make a point, in German is very complicated, I'm not going to get into that, but I wanted to make the point that there's a difference between talking about people and names for people, like Architekt und Architektin in German, or Architektor, Architekta, and practice. So I've been wondering, what do we gain by using matronage instead of patronage?
That's a good question.
What do we gain by saying women always, from antiquity to the early 20th century, always operate differently when they have their hands in having buildings built, because what also patronizes a wide range of what we've been talking about. What do we gain? And as a feminist, I find it odd to say women always do things differently, and they never engage in patronage. They never have that kind of power that is implied in that word. Now we can critique that there's a pater in there, but avoiding it, I'm not sure we're gaining much by it. So I just want to put that there and really say, what do we gain by it? And especially from a feminist point of view, and in light of what Keynote and Anurada was saying yesterday as well.
Absolutely. I think I will allow us to close on that point, since we're right about at the end here, and I just need to do the conclusion of the symposium. Thank you so much for all of you who stayed with us for Saturday morning. As we all know here, we are working hard at the publication of a book, and along with several authors who, by the way, who are not here at the symposium at all. And I envision it as 2 separate volumes on women in the built environment before 1800. The first volume is intended to present women as builders, designers, and critics. And these are the women who are doing things other than patronage. But it does also include some patrons whose work can be labeled and thought about in different ways. Perhaps not even using the term patron, depending on the particular work. It covers a very broad Western geographic scope from Chile to Eastern Europe. This volume is more or less focused on the early modern period because of the material what the authors are working on. Yet the chapter that will be in it by the Brazilian author Mari de Moura will include women's practice of building their own homes that certainly may date back indefinitely, which I find quite fascinating. The second volume will represent a sort of expanded version of our roundtable. It includes some themes that we saw here about arbiters of public space, the question of authorship, but also some of the material on the politics of gender that are involved, and in essence is addressing patronage. This volume extends in terms of its scope from the ancient Roman period to the very early 19th century and broadens the geography from Europe to India. Both of these volumes will allow transcultural comparisons for those who wish to utilize it in teaching. We didn't have time to talk about the teaching aspect, but we could do that at a future time. And also to compare customs between different parts of the world. They will also offer case studies of deconstructing patronage and renaming and redefining women's actions within their social context as a means to understand women's history in a new light. In this final moment, I would like to express once again my sincerest heartfelt thanks to Consuelo and Francesca at the University of Arkansas's Rome Center and the center's administrators and staff, especially Fabio. You made this event definitely possible. I also would like to thank the great number of speakers who attended this symposium in person and speaking remotely from around the world to convene for the first time and to express in one unified language a state of the question of these important and influential matrons of the historical built environment. Thank you so much.
I want really to thank you, Shaylee, because without you, this event was not possible at all. Your enthusiasm, patience, commitment, and the energy you have been putting since long time to make this happen, it's unvaluable. So I think that we have, thank you all. Thank you all. Now start crying. And thank you all for being here, for being so for your papers and for your works, you have with generosity share it with all of us. And I think that we might say that we have created a momentum, and this is only because of you. And this is really accept my personal gratitude. And on behalf of our director, Francesco Bedeschi, I really express his thanking. And yeah, probably, this is a wish to be here again in how long? 2 years, 8 years, I don't know. That will be Shelley to lead the project again. And finally, I want to thank Francesca. Yes, I want to thank Francesca. I really put on the on the carriage. I pushed her to say you have to be in this project, and so you've done a wonderful job. It's her first time to organize a conference, and she has had a baby only 7 months ago. And thank you. and then my friends. And last but not least, certainly Fabio, because without him, again, thank you, Fabio. And I want to thank also Adelina. She's following again us from Melbourne, Australia, and probably she wants to connect to say hello. Where she's over there? Yes. And well, Francesca first and Adelina then.
Thanks, Consuelo. Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, everybody. This was really a challenge. So it worked out very well. We are all very satisfied. Everything went really smooth. I have no troubles. So I consider it a great success. While the roundtable was taking place, I was curious to check from what parts of the world our speakers were coming from. And since, as I said, I consider this symposium a success, I want to share with you that we had speakers from Italy, Poland, UK, Ireland, France, Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, Canada, US, India, Turkey. We are spreading a big message all around.
It's the United Nations of Women in History.
Yes, that's where I was trying to go. So thanks also, and please let me highlight it, to the Faye John School of Architecture of the University of Arkansas, because we exist thanks to their commitment. So thanks again. And what's next? We're looking forward to the publication of the books that Shelley just introduced and the next edition of WoArch, hopefully in 2 years' time. So spread the message around. We will do our best to sponsor the next edition. It will take place here, of course, yes, and I hope it will be equally successful. So thanks again, everybody. And probably it makes absolutely sense to give the stage to Adelina, who's in a way or another is really contributing a lot to the successfulness of this edition. So Adelina, please, if you want to tell us some things, it's the right moment.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Is it still morning or it's just come on to 12 o'clock? Yes, I'm coming from Melbourne, so we're in the evening here. I'd just like to add my congratulations to Shelley, to Francesca, to Consuelo for this wonderful, stimulating symposium, to all the speakers for their wonderful, thought-provoking presentations. It's really a pleasure to have been part of this for the last 3 days. What I wanted to talk to you about now is the forthcoming AWAC edition, 4th edition of AWAC, annual International Women in the Arts Conference, which is held every year here at Palazzo Taverna in October. This year will be in the second week of October. We shall be sending out a call for papers very soon. And general theme will be love, marriage and desire, but we will fill in the details when we send out the call shortly. It will be within the next couple of weeks. So everyone, please keep an eye out for the call for papers for the 4th edition of AWAC, and we'd love to see you all here with us, whether in presence or virtually. Thank you very, very much, and goodbye and good luck to everybody.
Thank you. All right, so we close it here. Thanks again, everybody, and have a very good day in Rome.